With that being said, though, I wanted to move on and jump into the meat of our webinar today. And as I mentioned, I think this is going to be a great webinar. Our webinar today is Scaling DevOps for the Enterprise with GitHub. It is sponsored by our friends at IBM and really talks about GitHub Enterprise, right? Many of you may already be familiar with GitHub. You know, there's only 15 million or some odd accounts out there. So, you know, you already know a little bit about GitHub, but how much do you know about GitHub Enterprise? GitHub Enterprise is hosted as a service, etc. It's going to be a great presentation. Part of what makes it a great presentation, though, too, is our panel. So if we can move to our next slide, and let me introduce you to our panel members. I'm the moderator, as you can see my mug there, but I want to direct your attention to Michael King, who's the Director of Enterprise Marketing at GitHub, and I've actually spoken to Michael now for a number of months about GitHub Enterprise and the offering we're going to talk about today. And Michael and I are joined by Chris Brealey, Senior Technical Staff Member, IBM Bluemix. Michael, Chris, welcome to today's event.
Thanks, Alan. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you. Chris, okay, that was our sound check, guys, so we're all good. Let's move on from here then. Before we get started, I like to make it interactive with our audience, and so I thought we'd open things up perhaps with some polling questions. And here's our first one. As I mentioned, I think most of us are familiar with Git or GitHub today, but let's find out. Would you guys mind just logging on here and giving us, are you familiar with Git or GitHub? Personal use, professional use, not familiar at all? We'll close out questioning in about 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, survey says, wow, 47%, almost half of you are using this for professional use, are using Git or GitHub for professional use, 26% personally, but surprisingly, 26% of you are not using Git in any manner today. And that is surprising, but that's good. I think you guys have learned a lot today, and hopefully it'll kind of open your eyes to a little bit. We have one or two other polling questions, if we might, Jules. And this would be primarily for the 75% or so of you who are using Git or GitHub. Are you using it in a public cloud environment? In other words, in a shared resource, public cloud, what have you. And again, if you can vote here, I don't want to take up too much time, but it'll help us kind of define where our audience is, and it'll help Michael and Chris go through this. So we'll close this out in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Survey says, so almost half of you are not using Git or GitHub in public cloud, and evenly split between the personal and professional uses. Interesting. Guys, my panel members, Chris and Michael, any comment on that?
Not a huge surprise. I mean, as we'll talk about, you know, GitHub's used pretty widely, and I think most people are familiar with it for personal use. And even if they do use it at work, they may be using it personally as well. So, not a huge surprise there.
Yeah, not a surprise here either. I mean, we've been on a fairly concerted mission to adopt use of GitHub, you know, GitHub.com or GitHub Enterprise as the need requires, you know, here at IBM across numerous projects.
But let me ask a question on the public cloud usage. So if I'm using, you know, I have a Git account, right, on GitHub. It's in a shared environment, but would that be considered in the public cloud or no? Michael?
It would be. It would indeed be. If you're using sort of the public solution or the, you know, the public GitHub.com solution, then you're using it on a public cloud, meaning that you're using it with other folks.
Got it. So while we were talking, we put up our next question, which was, if your organization is not using Git or GitHub, what is the key reason? And here's interesting: 75, three quarters of you, 75%, are using a different sort of repo kind of, you know, repository kind of solution. and then 25% don't have the resources to manage it. Interesting, right? Metrics right there, guys, and rather than calling it out right now, Michael and Chris, I think we should keep that in mind as we move forward here with our presentation. So audience, thanks for participating in that. I love when it gets interactive, and I love to find out sort of what our audience's experiences are with these things as we do them in webinars. So that being said, let's move along now to our next slide. Slide mover. Okay, you know what, maybe I'll take over moving slides if I could have control. Jules? Okay, next slide. So, oh, we went too many there. It's okay.
We'll preview for people.
Yeah, we'll give you a little preview. Okay, we'll get it straight. It's all continuous. Anyway, so, you know, we're talking today about GitHub Enterprise and using it as a hosted service, but really what we're talking about are tools we could use as we seek to scale DevOps across the enterprise. And you know, make no mistake, DevOps has had its turn at influencing and shaping what we're doing in enterprises around development, around deployment, and so forth. So Michael, Chris, I'm going to let you kind of take over from here and, you know, talk a little bit about DevOps influence on the enterprise and how that plays into this whole idea of why GitHub is so successful.
Sure. Chris, do you want to start us out then, and then I'll answer the second part of that?
Yeah, why not? I mean, at the risk of philosophizing a little bit, you know, we've been going through several journeys through DevOps, and I say that because when I look across a number of the teams and the projects and the various kinds of applications that, for example, we work on here at IBM, or if I look across you know, the kinds of projects that many of our customers endeavor to execute, we see a lot of variety in DevOps way. You know, there's no one sort of recipe that fits everyone, but there are a few sort of common principles we come across. And certainly one that I think we've learned in spades here is that, you know, tools are all fine and well, and they're certainly important to have, and you know, we love our repositories, and we love our, you know, our delivery pipelines and our editors. Practices are, you know, just as, if not more important than the tools that manifest them. But at the end of the day, the DevOps journey that we've gone through and that we see many of our customers go through begins with culture. And, you know, for better or worse, it often begins with challenging the current culture and thinking about ways to stretch or to change or to, you know, try new ways of working. So, you know, when it comes to some of the principles on this chart here, such as empowerment, I mean, this takes several different forms. You know, empowerment can mean the freedom to try new ways with the support of the line of business. You know, let's be honest, it can sometimes be difficult to, you know, try out some ideas around a DevOps way, to try some new tools or a different practice than you may be used to without a certain measure of support within the business. So that's always a very important thing. You know, empowerment as the right to use the skills you have to bring different technical skills, for example, to bear on different parts of an application versus perhaps trying to impose one technology stack on the entire thing. But also the right to learn new skills and, you know, use some of these DevOps transformations as an excuse, if you will, to, you know, try new techniques, try new languages, try new practices. Empowerment also sort of includes just the expectation, if you will, of self-organizing, giving teams or squads or whatever your sort of mini organizational units are a degree of freedom in deciding how to shape themselves. So quite often you might see, you know, not only is there no single DevOps way, you know, from business to business, but often the details of a DevOps approach, you know, the practices you follow, the tools you use may vary from project to project. They could vary from squad to squad, sometimes even from person to person. What we've sort of found as we, you know, empower folks, you know, sort of give them the freedom to try things, to fail fast, to keep practices and tools that work, to toss the ones that don't, to adjust practices and tools. Don't always take them as verbatim or rote. What we sort of do as part of this whole transformation is start small. We don't set out, and we certainly, in working with many customers, we don't set out to try and, tackle DevOps on a massive scale. This may be a little bit sort of philosophical, but in many respects, I think DevOps at enterprise scale begins with DevOps in a few select corners. Try a few things on a couple of apps, try some things on a couple of teams or in a couple of projects. Many of the techniques, again, the practices, the tools, the cultural approaches that we have tried, that our customers have tried, we've collected a lot of these on something we call the IBM Garage method. You can take a peek at it sort of, anytime you like at ibm.com/devops/method. It's kind of an encyclopedia of many of the things we've tried and that our customers have tried, and in many, many cases found very successful. But at the end of the day, it presents options, right? It's there to sort of help you try some of these different approaches to a DevOps way. But I'll tell you this, one thing that I think has proven to be a very, very common element of many approaches has been GitHub and GitHub Enterprise. I mean, we've rallied around that extensively in many of the projects that we run here. All of our developers, say on my own team, and I'll get into this a little bit later, make very, very heavy use of it, and not just as the tool for what it is, but because GitHub and GitHub Enterprise actually support our practices, and it supports our culture, and it supports who we want to be as we deliver software to our customers. But I'll stop there, let Michael get a few words in edgewise.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I mean, it may sound somewhat strange coming from a vendor of software and tools, but I think you're 100% correct. This really does all start with an openness and an empowerment. And the choice of tools and the reflections of that choice, whether folks are choosing GitHub to do the work in or another tool, does really reflect that shift in culture. And those of us that have been sort of in IT for a while or in development for a while, this is it's a little hard for us to get our arms around. We're used to saying, we're going to build software in this specific way, and we're going to house all of our source code in this specific place and use these specific tools. And so particularly if you're in a regulated industry or you're in a highly restrictive industry, it's a hard sort of pill to swallow. But you'll note that the most successful software organizations, whether they're vendors that are building software for commercial use or large open source projects, these are self-organized, and people work in the ways they want to work on them. And so if you just use that as a model, that's a great place to start. And you may not find yourself with the ability to get all the way to autonomously organizing teams and pure participant autonomy and all the other pieces like that. You may not be able to get there, this week, this month, this year. But if that's the goal and that's sort of the place you're aiming for, then the technology choices just sort of fall out from that.
Excellent. So let's move along here, if we can. So
yes,
Michael, yeah, go ahead. I was going to say, if you give us some GitHub facts here.
Yeah, so I noticed there was a number of folks that, I think the number was 26% that don't currently use Git or GitHub. So it's possible you don't know a lot about who we are, so I'll just give the quick vanity stats. And we were founded in 2008 by a couple of guys who really loved open source, and we'll talk a little bit about why they built it. And in the past couple of years, we've grown from a relatively small startup to we're more than 660 people now, and we're kind of bursting at the seams. We're expanding globally. We've got 16 million regular users contributing to over 36 million repositories, including the majority of open source projects in the world. If you look at everything from the Swift project that IBM's involved with to everything else, all of those things are housed and certainly contributed to on GitHub. We're really proud of the fact that over 1,000 universities currently use GitHub, and we're growing that number literally on a daily basis. And so we like to think about folks using GitHub from the minute they turn on the monitor and start coding to the time they find their first job, to the time they decide to stop developing and move on to something else, and maybe that something else is government or sciences or something else like that, and oftentimes they're still going to be using GitHub. So we really like to talk about how GitHub enables a true developer life cycle. Lastly, we estimate that 50% of developers have a GitHub account, and certainly I think that estimate is probably actually a little bit low, but it all depends on how you define a developer. So with that, we'll move to the next slide. Talk a little bit about sort of how we came into being, and certainly how we think about the products. As I said before, we were founded in 2008, and you know, Chris Wansters, our CEO, tells a great story about him and PJ and Tom and the rest of the guys who founded it, how they started off and they built GitHub because, you know, they really liked open source. I mean, they were big participants in the Ruby projects and other open source projects, and they loved Git, but to hear Chris tell us, he says it was really painful to use, and so we just wanted to build something to make Git and working on open source projects easier to use for us, and that sort of philosophy, that ethos of building things for developers, building a product that is from the get-go developer first has remained and continues to remain a key focus of ours. Everybody in the company uses GitHub. If you're on the legal team, if you're in marketing, if you're at the front desk, all the way up to our lead engineers and everyone else like that, everybody uses GitHub, and so we're constantly drinking our own champagne, if you will. But it's also, we're also all learning different aspects of coding all the time, and so we're all kind of learning together. So they built GitHub, and it was pretty darn successful. But what happened is we had a lot of developers that were coming to us and saying, you know what, I love using GitHub on this open source project, but you know, quite frankly, we really would like to be able to use it for some of the work we're doing at XYZ company. And so we created the corporate teams project so that small teams could self-organize within these corporations. But what we pretty quickly found out in the next year and a half or so was that there are many organizations that have a requirement for something that sits sort of behind the firewall, or at least controlled by that specific enterprise. And so we launched the Enterprise project, which was basically GitHub behind the firewall. With each of these products, whether it's the public product or the corporate teams product or the enterprise product, the GitHub user experience, what the developer sees, how the developer interacts with GitHub, remains the same. We started an interesting project in 2012, and it saw light in 2013, of ChatOps, which is basically a way to integrate GitHub into your chat clients so that you can do deploys directly from a chat client, or you can do you can initiate actions directly from a chat client. Then in 2014, we launched GitHub Enterprise 2.0, and this was basically GitHub Enterprise now on VMs. And you know, again, that's just being able to take a GitHub Enterprise appliance, instead of having to stand up your own server on your firewall. You could run it. You could run it yourself in a cloud. You could maintain it yourself in some sort of public cloud formation, or even on your own private cloud sitting behind your firewall. But again, what we found was that this was difficult for many companies to sort of justify and to really say, okay, yeah, we want to manage all of this ourselves, when the developers are sort of beating down the door saying we really want to use GitHub. And so this brings us to where we are today, which is this partnership with IBM Bluemix. And the goal of this partnership is again to provide GitHub Enterprise to the largest possible number of developers, specifically developers within enterprises. And many of these enterprises are coming back to us saying, we don't have the folks and we don't want to stand up the servers and other things like that. And that's where this managed service from IBM Bluemix comes in and is so useful. So as opposed to saying, the process being, okay, my developers want GitHub, okay, great, let's go buy the instance, let's go stand up some servers, either within a public cloud or internally, on a quarterly basis, let's maintain that, do the upgrades, all those other pieces like that. They call up our friends at IBM and they say, I want GitHub Enterprise, and you can do it local, on Bluemix local, and Bluemix dedicated, and it becomes just like a utility, where IBM, with some of the really cool technology they built into Bluemix, like Brealey and everything else like that, they keep it on, they keep the lights on, they keep everything running, and instead of someone giving me a call and saying I can't get to my GitHub, it just works, and that's really what developers are used to. That's the kind of reliability, that's the kind of user experience that developers are used to with GitHub, and so with IBM Bluemix we're providing that to developers working in enterprises that may be, again, highly regulated or may find themselves just not, quite frankly, not wanting to stand up and maintain a GitHub Enterprise service. So that's kind of the timeline. Sorry for being a little long-winded there, but I just wanted to emphasize again, we really do try and build everything from the viewpoint of a developer first, and our goal with all of the enterprise products is to get this in the hands of as many developers as possible working within enterprises. Now, obviously, because it's an enterprise product, we have all sorts of questions we have to answer. So we can move on to the next slide. We have all sorts of questions we have to answer about security and manageability and reliability and scale and everything else like that. And that's really where GitHub Enterprise differs a little bit from the public GitHub that we're all used to. You'll notice that the UX is the same as GitHub.com, and because of that, your developers who have oftentimes started using GitHub in college or sometimes before, I talk proudly about my 10-year-old daughter who has her own GitHub account, obviously with my permission, but they start using it at a very early age. So when a developer comes in day one, they can be productive. They can be productive because the UI that they use at home to work on open source projects or work with their friends on projects is identical in GitHub Enterprise, and so that ramp up is days. And then that transparency that again, across groups, across entire companies is already there. Obviously, I always talk about security and reliability and compliance being binary questions. So if you can't answer, if you can't do the LDAP and the SAML stuff, if you can't, pass the audits, if you can't be trusted risk sectors, then you can't even start to have a conversation. If you can't support the number of users that you have on a single instance and you can't do clustering to support global users, then again, you can't really consider the solution. If you don't have multiple deployment options and branch permissions and other things like that, again, you can't use the product. So in order to get GitHub in the hands of as many developers as possible, we have to be able to answer those binary questions. Now, what we also have done, though, at the behest of many of our administrators, is add API and custom access levels and dashboards and things like that, so that you can keep an eye on your teams and understand which are the productive ones and which are the not so productive ones and where could they use help. And this, again, to Chris's point earlier about starting small and growing, is important because you're learning with each team's experience. And you may find your web teams are productive with a certain tool set in certain times, and you may find that your API teams are less productive with that same tool set and that same testing regimen and same other things like that, and so you may want to switch things around, and that's really where those customized access levels and monitoring dashboards come in. Lastly, I'll point out the extensibility, because we have this technology ecosystem, and this is actually where I think we've done some great work out of the gate, but we have a lot more work to do with the IBM Bluemix folks, is understanding what are the right combinations of tools to go along with IBM Bluemix, GitHub, and others that really support this DevOps lifecycle, that really support the developer and certainly the entire DevOps workflow. And that's where I think we can get some really interesting packages going. We've got a great ecosystem. IBM Bluemix has a great ecosystem, and I think the power of those two together really opens up some opportunities for DevOps within an enterprise. So I think we can move to the next slide. Perfect. And Chris, if you want to take this one, talk a little bit about Bluemix. I know I kind of preempted you a bit there, so apologies.
Oh, no worries. It was all good stuff. I probably shouldn't say this, but I'd be willing to hazard that maybe not quite as high a percentage of folks have heard of Bluemix who may have heard of GitHub. But word is spreading. And I won't spend too much time here, but I do want to give folks sort of a feel for what Bluemix is based on, what it's all about. It is, in a nutshell, our hybrid cloud platform. And I finally decided to actually go look up hybrid on the dictionary because we use the word so much, right? And basically it amounts to, as an adjective, any sort of composition or formation from disparate or heterogeneous objects or elements, which all sounds quite fancy. But I think it's fairly relevant to Bluemix because we can interpret it in a number of ways. First of all, just the hybrid nature of the thing in sort of the classic definition of hybrid cloud. Bluemix is alive and well on public. It's available at bluemix.net or assorted other URLs in other regions. But it's also available in what we call dedicated. So this is a IBM managed virtually private sort of single company tenant instance of the Bluemix cloud. It's also available in what we call local or physically private. And again, often when folks talk about hybrid cloud, usually it's a reference to clouds and applications that sort of can span the public, dedicated, or local environments, if you will. So that's probably what we typically mean by it. But it's sort of, I like to think of it as hybrid in a number of other ways as well. IBM Bluemix supports a hybrid suite of cloud abstractions from good old-fashioned IaaS, infrastructure as a service, just the ability to get at VM, virtual machine, bare metal, various other infrastructural services on the cloud, platform as a service. So the ability to directly deploy applications and application patterns and handy-to-use services without all that sort of tedious mucking about with middleware and servers. And kind of, I don't know if it's in the middle of those two or not, but containers as a service. So container services on IBM Bluemix that are based on Docker, allowing you to run workloads within containers. This kind of hybrid nature has proven very useful even for ourselves as we deploy a lot of our own goodies onto Bluemix because it allows us to choose the abstraction level that is most appropriate for the kind of workload. And I'll give you an actual case of that a little later in our webinar. There's a variety of services available in Bluemix, over 140 at last count. Many of them in such interesting areas as cognitive and Watson, speech analysis services and tone analysis services and all sorts of other fancy things. Internet of Things services, mobile services, some of the perhaps less fancy but frankly most important types of services such as databases, data analytics, security, runtimes, a variety of runtimes, particularly at the platform as a service level of Bluemix, such as Java, Node, .NET, Go, Python, Ruby, just to name a few, Swift, one of our most recent additions to the catalog, and a sort of hybrid breadth of the cloud. And by that I mean not just a cloud for production workloads, but a cloud for the software delivery lifecycle. And nothing may exemplify that more than the availability of GitHub Enterprise for the Bluemix dedicated environment. I will just point out, Bluemix is built heavily on open source and open communities that we also participate with, along with many other vendors and companies. I'd say the preeminent ones here are Cloud Foundry, which is really the sort of the PaaS open source aspect of Bluemix that underpins much of its function. OpenStack, mainly at the IaaS level, and Docker and the Open Container Initiative. So Bluemix is built heavily on, and we contribute heavily to those kinds of initiatives. We're probably right up there in being fans of open source, along with the folks that got GitHub on the rails that Michael was telling you about before. So, Bluemix, hybrid cloud, public dedicated local, spanning IaaS to PaaS capabilities, and going back to roughly February when we announced the partnership, now featuring GitHub Enterprise, recognizing that clouds are not just for production workloads, but they are for the developers and the development lifecycle as well. I think we could maybe flip the next page.
So I think this is actually pretty quickly, we can run through this one pretty quickly, but I think this is an important point, and we made it a little bit, that this is the first time that we've offered GitHub Enterprise as a cloud-hosted managed service. And that managed service is an important piece because, as I said before, there are lots of enterprises we work with that want to roll out GitHub to the developers but don't want to go through the pain and the effort of continually managing it. And so their developers can learn code, but it's all occurring within the private, secure environment of Bluemix that IBM has provided. And certainly, I think that I can't emphasize enough that the sheer volume of services that are available on GitHub that are easily integratable, and everything kind of happens within that sandbox. And lastly, for customers, specifically customers that are in places of the world that have heavy regulation around data privacy, or in industries that are heavily regulated around data privacy, that global presence with the 25 data centers worldwide helps a lot. It helps a lot when you have to answer questions about, hey, where was this code created? Where does this code reside? How is this stuff being worked on? So we're super excited about this, and I know we've been talking about this partnership for a little while now, but just want to make sure that everyone understands like how far this really does go.
So maybe I can chat a little bit about what it really means by us and managing GitHub Enterprise as part of the Bluemix platform, joined to the hip, as it were. In some ways, it starts with maybe a little peek under the hood, just of the deployment layout, which isn't really depicted here, but it's pretty easy to explain. To achieve the kinds of qualities of service that Michael was talking about earlier, if you look at a garden variety IBM Bluemix dedicated cloud, and you look at GitHub Enterprise deployed there, it is deployed with a primary and replica virtual machine to keep all your files safe, and 2 levels of backup to a backup VM that in turn is backed up to an off-site eVault VM, and a few sort of nifty little apps that run in PaaS fashion on Bluemix and help to link GitHub Enterprise loosely into the into the Bluemix experience. A simple example being that in order to log in to GitHub Enterprise, you log into Bluemix. So your credentials really work for both systems, part and parcel. Quite a bit of monitoring in place to keep everything running smooth and make sure that if, God forbid, anything were to go a little haywire, we get immediate alerts on PagerDuty, notifications aplenty to various Slack channels that we monitor. Which incidentally touches on a point Michael made earlier. We found Slack as one of several examples of other tools that form a really valuable part of a DevOps tool chain. A little more on that later. But we have monitors in place, right? And these monitors help keep an eye on the VMs, everything from the hardcore OS health around disk memory and so forth, all the way up to making sure that some of those little apps I mentioned that help to couple GitHub Enterprise into Bluemix and vice versa are alive and running and generally feeling happy about life. There's certainly other aspects of the management of GitHub Enterprise that I think you would just expect. Routine upgrades, for example, handled. I mean, the bottom line is really what Michael said before. You get all the pleasure and power and the good ease of making use of GitHub Enterprise, in a proprietary environment without really the overhead of having to maintain it yourself. And I mean, we've been using that model ourselves. I mean, we not only work with Michael and company on this stuff, but we use it, and that's been definitely a burden lifted right there. Michael, I don't know if you'd like to add anything at all on this chart.
No, I think that's great. The only other thing I'd say is that those upgrades are pretty darn important, particularly if you've got a complicated environment with multiple geographic instances and other things like that. So I think that's a very, very valuable service.
Okay, why don't I talk a little bit about this one? So we have what we loftily call here an internal transformation project, and we call it Whitewater, and it's, I honestly don't know why, but that's the code name we picked for it many moons ago. And you know, at the very least, we get this nice picture of some whitewater rafting here. And maybe the idea is that it's supposed to feel adventurous. And I'll tell you, from the transformations and the journeys, which incidentally we never quite finish through DevOps that we've been on, they are adventurous, and a sense of adventure certainly doesn't hurt. But what Whitewater is all about, it's really an internal effort to incrementally grow best-in-class tools, practices, you know, patterns that work really, really well, proven to work really, really well, I should say, for projects that actually do or really want to follow key modern sort of DevOps, Agile-oriented approaches. All right, so you know, projects where we make use of IBM design thinking to really get what the customer needs and do our best to target it, to involve customers in the design process itself, to Agile and lean startup principles and methods. All these sorts of things here are what we have Whitewater around as an internal organization to sort of help define examples of some of the tools. You know, again, no offense, but GitHub is not by any stretch the only tool you want to have in your kit bag. It's absolutely pivotal as a repository. Personally, don't know how we'd live without it, but you know, we've got a bunch of other tools that are in the mix that really help complete the story. Examples of what Whitewater has found very useful, and we again use these in much of our own development, are Slack for collaboration, Mural if you're into design and you know, doing lots of really interesting techniques around design thinking like empathy maps or storyboards or what have you. But again, not just the tools, the practices, the importance of code review, whether it's through pull requests or pair programming or some other technique, the importance of continuous delivery. Whitewater's kind of you know, our internal mission to help you know, lay down what we would consider are the exemplar tools and practices and guidance for taking the DevOps journey. And there's lots of variety that's possible around what we start with in Whitewater. You can think of Whitewater as defining sort of a core recommended set, and as I alluded to earlier, you know, various projects or teams will certainly modify that or amend what Whitewater has to say. But that's the gist of it, right? The numbers, if you will, in a fairly few number of months, we've ramped up to over 200 teams and over 9,000 users, making use of GitHub Enterprise and some of these other tools and practices that we've collected under Whitewater. There's a few other sort of details here around, I guess you could call them philosophical important points around tools and culture and practices and how these feed on each other. We've covered a little bit of that already, so I won't dwell on it any further.
Yeah, and I just want to add quickly, I mean, the speed in which you guys have been able to transform and grow it, it's interesting. We mentioned earlier about the cultural shift that needs to occur first, and I think that's something you guys did right. You made that cultural shift quickly, and that's what's enabled the number of teams and the number of developers to really find their way to GitHub. First GitHub Enterprise, but moreover find their way to the Whitewater project. And really, you know, the team there is just top notch. They really are.
Well, thanks. And I mean, just looking back, right, if I compare how our team behaves now to how a team or teams I worked on maybe even 2 or 3 years ago behave, it's almost night and day. And you know, it's change, and it can be scary at first, but you know, looking back, it's been a heck of a journey, and we might be able to talk a little bit more about our own journey in a minute or two. But the transformation itself has been, you know, very beneficial. And again, I'm not sure it ever quite ends. We're always trying new things.
That's right.
So yeah, speaking of the personal story, I'm not going to go too deep into this because we want to make sure we leave some good time for Q&A. But look, you know, you saw a minute ago that we've you know, had over 9,000 folks ramp up on the likes of GitHub Enterprise in IBM. We've had hundreds of squads and thousands of people take the DevOps journey. It's a big story, and frankly, I find it almost a little bit too big sometimes. It's not terribly personal, but I'll give you an idea of what our own team does. And for our team here, which we call the Bluemix DevOps Services Project, that builds, you guess it, the Bluemix DevOps Services platform as part of the Bluemix Cloud. DevOps means two things to us. First of all, we deliver Bluemix DevOps Services. This is the software on the cloud that we develop. We design it, we develop it, we test it, we deploy it, and we manage it for all sundry users out there on Bluemix public or dedicated. But we also follow the principles, right? We've sort of talked about this already, I suppose, but we follow a DevOps way, and it's a DevOps way that works for us, and it probably won't look quite the same as anybody else's. But the point is, it's a little bit, I'm not sure if there's a symmetry here, but we build DevOps tools and we follow a DevOps way. And here are just some of the, some of the practices and the tools that we have found particularly useful. And again, at the end of the day, they support our culture and who we are. Moreover, these are some of the more preeminent practices and tools that integrate directly or fairly strongly with GitHub or GitHub Enterprise. I mean, as Michael mentioned before, pretty much if you know your way around GitHub, you already know your way around GitHub Enterprise and vice versa. And we actually do use both, by the way. While the majority of the DevOps services code that we write is proprietary, it isn't all proprietary. I mean, we're actually building here something that we're going to call, or that we're calling Open Tool Chain. It's sort of the evolution of the Bluemix DevOps services goodies. And the key word in Open Tool Chain is open. So some of the so-called brokers that we use to plug tools into the Open Tool Chain, we have those sitting up in repositories on GitHub, right? GitHub.com, so that they are open for others to contribute to. So we actually use both, and it's invaluable to, I'd say, all of our developers, that whether they're working with GitHub or GitHub Enterprise, it pretty much feels the same. But there's a number of important practices we follow, and GitHub supports these for us really as part of all, if I can call it this, the GitHub culture. It supports pull requests and pair programming insofar as whether two developers are sitting in the same box, cube, office, working on some code together, or whether we have one squad in almost a mini social coding fashion issuing pull requests against code in another squad. GitHub supports this, makes it easy and natural for us to do. And I'd say that our, the rate and quality of code that the development team's able to produce has gone up as a result of being able to do things like pull requests and pair programming supported by GitHub and GitHub Enterprise. We do a lot of automated testing. We have a lot of autonomy within our squads and an ability to choose techniques that work. So not every squad uses, say, a given repository in GitHub Enterprise quite the same way as another does. There is room for variety here.
Yeah, and that's always a big goal within the product too, is that you want to provide enough consistency where people feel they're comfortable using it, but enough flexibility in the tool where people are going to use it in different ways and integrate different components and utilize different repos. And so you've got to walk that line always, definitely.
You do, and we try not to be, we try not to dictate too much stuff if we can possibly help it. I mean, an example is that we really strongly recommend that all of our squads follow infrastructure as code as a practice. Don't just put your code in the repository. Put your deployment automation, whether it's stuff that's run by our own delivery pipeline or by Urban Code Deploy or by Jenkins or whatever your continuous build and delivery tooling is, put that in the repository as well. It should be versioned, right? It should be managed and treated just like code proper, if you will. But I'll fess up. We've got a couple of squads that haven't gotten around to doing that yet, and no, we don't take them out back and shoot them for it, right? We let them discover the benefits of this on their own, and we have the other squads demonstrate by example. And quite often, the perhaps most expedient way to get folks to try these practices or to try these tools is to show how successful they are, over in that squad over there. And oh wow, look at what they can do. Let's give that a try ourselves. And the result is that we've got quite a bit of commonality across our squads, but it wasn't mandated.
It's inspire rather than dictate, we like to say.
Very much so. I think we can can zip forward here. So, so here's the deal. A lot of what we've talked about are sort of a mix of tools, not the least of which are the GitHub and GitHub Enterprise capabilities here. We've talked a little bit about culture and practices, and I'll just sort of repeat that certainly on our team, and I think you'll find this on many folks that, if you will, walk the DevOps path, the tools, practices, and culture that we use, they reflect and define who we are. They change gradually and significantly over time. They can vary from one squad to another, from one project to another. A lot of what we do and a lot of what our customers do with their DevOps journey, we've captured on the IBM Garage method I mentioned earlier in the talk. That's also a resource that we dip into to try new things as we continue the journey. But at the end of the day, when it finally comes down to, all right, we've got an idea of what sorts of tools we want that support our practices, that reinforce our culture, now let's go set all that up. The process of finding and procuring and configuring and integrating and otherwise gluing together a variety of tools, including things like GitHub Enterprise or Delivery Pipeline or Slack or PagerDuty, can get pretty onerous, and it kind of gets exponentially more complex as you bring more tools into the mix. So as a bit of an aside in I suppose, our chat, and I alluded to it earlier, we've been building over the last few months sort of the next edition of Bluemix DevOps services, of which GitHub Enterprise plays a pivotal part, and we call it Open Tool Chain. You can actually give this thing a try anytime you like. I've got a URL hiding on the next chart for it. We won't go there quite yet, but you'll see it in a moment. And if I try to really net it out, this Open Tool Chain DevOps services capability up on the Bluemix cloud is in many respects an attempt to manifest a growing set of tools and practices and so forth that you would find in the Garage method. And again, GitHub Enterprise is one of the mainstays of the Open Tool Chain. You can even see an example of an actual tool chain on this chart where we have 3 GitHub or GitHub Enterprise repositories, each with its own delivery pipeline. We've got some Sauce Labs in here for doing cloud-hosted testing. We've got the Eclipse Orion Web IDE for folks that want to use a web-based editor. We have PagerDuty in the mix and a few other goodies, Slack, and so on and so forth. And the real value to these tool chains is to capture as patterns the assembly of tools that are appropriate to the kind of project you want to run, and take a lot of the sting out of provisioning up that assembly of tools and getting the tools integrated to each other. So when we take the likes of GitHub Enterprise, Slack, and the Open Tool Chain, and we throw them together, we end up with, literally in a couple of clicks, the magic of delivery pipelines getting kicked off from GitHub Enterprise commits. And if those builds happen to go south, or if a test fails, alerts automatically get fired through Open Tool Chain from the delivery pipeline to PagerDuty, and so on and so forth. All right, so at the end of the day, Open Tool Chain, you can consider it an initiative that we're on here with GitHub Enterprise being a preeminent part of these typical tool chain patterns to help codify, common DevOps patterns and practices that we found to work very well. Can't go into it too much more deeply, but we'll flip to the next slide, which I may just net out as, have a peek at that URL at the bottom, and you can actually take it out for a spin and see what it's all about. But I do want to reinforce that DevOps services in the Open Tool Chain here are, at the end of the day, a means of stretching what we think of as cloud from the place you run your application workload without all of that sort of infrastructural mucking about to the place where you deliver software, you develop, you design, and ultimately run the workloads. We could peek under the hood. I don't think I'll do too much there except to point out that DevOps Services itself is a mix of PaaS apps, infrastructure apps, VMs, containers, uses a mix of languages, mostly Java, mostly Node, little tiny bit of Ruby off in a corner. and integrates right into GitHub Enterprise on a number of levels.
Okay, next.
All right. I think we're approaching sort of wrap-up mode here.
Yeah.
Great.
You know, I guess the only parting thought I toss out right here, and you know, Michael, you'll certainly chime in. When it comes to you know, scaling DevOps or dealing with DevOps at scale, you know, what you ultimately need are, you know, a method, you know, a culture, if you will, the tools and practices, a community of support. You know, between the likes of GitHub Enterprise, you know, and IBM Bluemix, you know, we're endeavoring to bring the kinds of tools and capabilities that support the kinds of practices that will allow, you know, allow you to execute DevOps at scale, at speed, you know, to find a way that works for you. The only parting advice I'd offer is start small, right? If you're wondering, how do I get into this whole DevOps thing and use GitHub Enterprise and continuously deliver changes in minutes like we are now able to do to our own platform into production, start small. Start with an app or two. Transform something. Create something new. You know, I just say don't try to do it whole hog.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that. And I say, you know, don't start small, because you need all three of these items. You need the method and sort of the best practices. You need the community, and you need the cultural buy-in at the highest levels, and then you need the tool and the platform. You know, trying to do it without having all three in line means you're probably not going to be successful. So, to your point, Chris, definitely start small.
Great. Guys, we are running low on time, so I'm going to jump in here. And
okay.
Obviously,
Alan, real quick, let me just mention that we've got GitHub Universe coming up September 13th through 15th.
Whoa. Okay.
And I know that we were working with our events team to offer everybody on a discount code for $50 off registration, and that's just DevOps in lowercase, Orbit 2016 in uppercase, and we'll just send an email out to everybody registered with all that information. So I think that's a great place to kind of learn how other people are doing just these things.
Absolutely, so it's called GitHub Universe?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And it's September 13th through 15th in San Francisco.
Excellent. All right, let's get to some questions, and I'm sorry we ran a little later, folks. And the good news is we have all of these questions, if you put them in the question section, in writing, and we can get them to Michael and Chris in writing, and hopefully append those to the recording of today's webinar. So, but let's jump right in. Is the functionality of GitHub Enterprise also available in GitHub Educational? Michael, that's probably a you question.
Sure. Yeah, it definitely is. Certainly all the developer functionality, all the collaboration, and all of the capabilities around the API outputs and sign commits and other things like that, all available in GitHub Educational as well. We also have some education clients who utilize GitHub Enterprise for their internal their internal usage, and they use GitHub Public or GitHub Education for anything external and student-facing. So yes, absolutely, and there's a bunch of different ways you can configure and deploy it.
Yep. Next question. Can GitHub provide SCM for any code base or technology base? For example, I have teams who use IBM data storage through to .NET through to COBOL on mainframe. Mm-hmm. Chris, that might be a you, or maybe Michael.
Yeah. Well, I'll leave it mostly to Michael, but I will say that we use a variety of languages, not just the ones you mentioned, but again, some sort of non-traditional stuff like deployment automation scripts. We'll put just about anything in our various GitHub Enterprise repositories. Whether it's JavaScript, JavaScript, Ruby, you name it. I haven't come across a case where we can't drop something in there. Just the API, the command line interface, the integration with the many tools. to me, it's shown itself to be just language capable, language agnostic. Michael?
Yeah, no, totally agree with that point, Chris. And the other thing I'd say is if we have folks that append large design files or large image files or other things like that, and a lot of times they'll use Git LFS or large file service to that as well, which is a part of GitHub.
Yeah, we had a few questions, guys, from the audience. Same question by a few different people requesting to see a demo of GitHub Enterprise on Bluemix, and I'm sorry that time didn't allow it for this webinar.
We can follow up with that.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. We can follow up with that and reach out directly to you. Just we'll get those questions answered ASAP.
We'll get them.
Yeah, be delighted to do that.
Yeah, as I said, there was a few people who asked, what about integration with tools like Jenkins?
Yeah, that's again kind of the power of the API and the ecosystem. We have a different approach than some other folks in this space, in that we don't want to be everything, right? We don't want to be your chat client. We don't want to be your continuous integration build server. We want to work with the best, and we want to offer choice. And so what we've done is we've taken a very open API-based approach. We work well with Jenkins, and we work well with Circle CI, and we work well with a bunch of the other services available both in Bluemix and some that are not yet available but soon to be available in Bluemix. So long-winded answer, yes, we work quite well with Jenkins, and we have a number of folks that have already deployed that, that configuration.
Chris, here's one for you. With Bluemix, how easy is it to deploy using Docker?
It's really quite easy. We have, beginning in Bluemix Public, it's not quite ready and dedicated yet, a container service in Bluemix. And in the DevOps services that go along with Bluemix Public are some handy jobs in the delivery pipeline that make it really quite straightforward to work into your delivery automation, the construction of Docker images and the hosting of Docker containers on the Bluemix platform. So as I might have mentioned earlier, Bluemix hosts good old-fashioned bare metal and virtual machines at the IaaS level. It'll host PaaS-style Cloud Foundry apps in a variety of languages, and it will host containers. So you can pretty much feed the thing a Docker file, and it'll go off and spin off a container for you and operate it for you on the cloud.
Okay, just a question or two more. Does Bluemix GitHub Enterprise support Jenkins 2.0 continuous delivery functionality? Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say, I know GitHub does, and I'm 99.9% sure that Bluemix does as well. So.
I believe so myself, from what little I know. Here's an interesting question. Well, actually, we're at the top of our hour. Someone asked for the link to the GitHub universe, and there was a code you mentioned, Michael.
Absolutely.
Can you get it to us, and we'll post it along with this when we put it up. Guys, we do have a number of other questions. I apologize. We will get them over to Michael and Chris. But we're at the top of the hour, and we respect your time. Michael, Chris, you know what? Thanks. I went out on a limb and said this was going to be a great webinar before we did it. But thanks for making it great. You guys did a great job, and welcome back here anytime. That was just fantastic. To our audience, thank you for joining us today. I hope that you found this as interesting as I did, and maybe we'll see you at a future DevOps.com webinar. To IBM and GitHub, thanks for sponsoring today's webinar. Much appreciated. Michael, Chris, again, thanks, guys. Hope to see you again. This is Alan Schimmel for DevOps.com. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.